Clara Vance pulled the wedding ring from her finger and set it on the table without a sound. Downstairs, her husband's laughter shook the walls. She had heard every word: reliable, convenient, maintenance, 7 years. 7 years she had kept his house carried, his name swallowed her voice. And tonight she finally understood that Jonathan Hale had never married a woman. He had acquired a service. She did not cry. She did not scream. She opened the bottom drawer and took out the deed to her mother's land. If this story moves something in you, subscribe. Stay until the very end and drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. The laughter downstairs had not stopped for 3 hours. Clara stood at the top of the stairs and listened to it rise through the floorboards, her husband's voice carrying above the others, loose and warm with bourbon, the way it always got when he had an audience worth impressing. She had heard that laugh 10,000 times. She had once thought it meant he was happy. She had once believed foolishly and completely that she was part of what made him so. She was barefoot. She had come down for water, nothing more. The hour was late, and the Virginia summer heat pressed through every wall of the house, thick and unmoving even past midnight. She had one hand on the stair rail and one hand loose at her side, and she was 2 steps from the kitchen door when Edward Miles's voice cut through the low murmur of the room and stopped her cold. Does she ever complain truly? A pause. The sound of bourbon being poured. Clara. Jonathan's voice carried a smile in it, that particular smile, the easy one, the one he used when he wanted men to think well of him. No, never. Lucky man. Luck has nothing to do with it. The smile stayed in his voice, settled and satisfied. She was raised right, knows what's expected, does what needs doing and doesn't make theater of it. High praise, someone said, and there was laughter and Clara's hand tightened on the rail. She's reliable, Jonathan said. Convenient. I don't have to think about her, and that's more than most men can say. Silence fell over the room below, a comfortable silence. The silence of men who found this reasonable. Then Miles spoke again, quieter, half laughing. She doesn't even know she's just maintenance. The room broke open with laughter. Clara did not move. She stood on the back stair with her hand pressed flat to the wall, and she listened to her husband laugh at the punchline of her life, and she felt something inside her go completely, terribly still. Not anger. Not yet. Something older. Something that had been building so quietly for so long that she had stopped noticing the weight of it, and now, all at once, she felt every pound of it settle onto her shoulders, and then just as suddenly, release. She turned and walked back up the stairs without a sound. She had been 22 years old when she married Jonathan Hale. He had been handsome in the way that mattered in Virginia in 1807, tall, well-spoken, with the kind of confidence that read as strength until you had lived close enough to it, long enough to see what it actually was. He had brought her wildflowers the first time he called. He had remembered the name of her mother's dog. He had laughed at her jokes, really laughed, or so she had thought, and he had looked at her across church on Sunday mornings with an expression she had mistaken for devotion. She understood now that a man could look at a piece of land the same way. Her father had sold his holdings to settle debts the year before the wedding. Jonathan had purchased the western parcel, the good land, the flat land, the land that edged the creek, and 3 months later he had asked for Clara's hand with a directness that her father had called refreshing. Clara had called it romantic. She had been 22, and she had not yet learned the difference between a man who wanted her and a man who wanted what came attached to her name. The marriage had been beautiful for approximately 1 season. Jonathan had been warm through that first autumn, attentive, in the careful way of a man who has not yet gotten what he came for and knows better than to show his hand too soon. He had asked her opinion on things. He had touched her hair when he passed her in the kitchen. He had called her my Clara in front of company, and she had felt the words like sunlight on her face. Then winter came, and he stopped asking, and she began to understand the shape of the life she had agreed to. "You're good at this," he had told her that first February, watching her manage the household accounts with a quill and a ledger while the fire burned low. He had said it the way a man compliments a well-trained horse. Appreciative. Impersonal. Already thinking about something else. She had smiled and said thank you, because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. Chuptles. She sat at the writing desk in the corner of the bedroom and did not light a candle. The moonlight through the window was enough. She knew this room by heart, every shadow, every creak, every inch of the space she had been permitted to occupy for 7 years. The bottom drawer stuck slightly in the summer heat. She worked it open with both hands carefully, quietly. Beneath the household accounts, 3 volumes, every penny documented in her own hand, and beneath the letters she had written and never sent, there was a single folded paper she had placed there 6 years ago. She had not touched it since. She unfolded it now. Clara Margaret Vance. Her name. Her mother's land. 32 acres of timber and creekbed west of the Hale property registered in the county record in 1806, the year her mother died. The deed predated the marriage. It had never been transferred. It had never been discussed. Jonathan did not know it existed. Clara had not told him. She had gone to the courthouse alone 2 years into the marriage on a morning when she said she needed fabric and thread. She had stood at the clerk's window with her heart hammering and asked very quietly whether a deed registered in a woman's maiden name remained valid after marriage. And the clerk, an older man with ink on his fingers and no particular interest in her question, had said that it depended on the county and the registration, and whether the woman's husband had ever filed against it. Jonathan had never filed against it because Jonathan did not know it was there. Clara folded the deed and held it in both hands in the dark and breathed. She heard him on the stairs just after midnight. His footsteps were heavier than usual, the bourbon the late hour, the satisfied weight of a man who had spent the evening being admired. She tucked the deed under the household accounts and closed the drawer, and was sitting with her hands folded in her lap when he came through the door. He stopped when he saw her awake. "You're up," he said. "Couldn't sleep. The heat." He moved to the wardrobe without particular concern. "Good evening downstairs. Miles is thinking of expanding east, wants my opinion on the Mercer property." He said this the way he said most things to her. Not conversation, announcement. The reporting of information to a piece of furniture that happened to be able to hear. "Will you ride out with him?" she asked. "Next week, most likely." He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off one boot. "You should sleep. Delia needs direction in the morning. I told Miles he could bring his wife for supper Thursday." Clara looked at him. At the broad, careless shape of him in the lamplight. At the easy set of his shoulders, the unbothered line of his jaw. He had laughed tonight. He had called her convenient, and then he had laughed. And now he was sitting on the edge of their bed, talking about supper Thursday, with the complete and total composure of a man who had never once considered that she might have heard. "Of course," she said. "I'll see to it." "Good." He lay back. Within minutes his breathing slowed. Clara did not move. She sat in the chair by the writing desk and watched her husband sleep, and understood with the cold clarity of a woman who has finally stopped arguing with the truth that he would sleep exactly this well every night for the rest of his life. Nothing she did or did not do would change the quality of Jonathan Hale's sleep. She had never been the kind of presence that cost him anything. Convenient, he had said. Maintenance. She looked at the drawer. She rose at 3:30. Jonathan did not stir. She dressed in the dark, the heavy blue traveling dress, the sturdy boots she wore for long rides. The bonnet she almost never used anymore because there had been so few places worth going. She moved through the room in the particular silence she had perfected over 7 years, the silence of a woman who has learned to exist without disturbing anything, and she felt something almost like grief for that, for how good she had become at making herself small. She packed one bag. 1. Her mother's brooch wrapped in linen. The deed folded into the inside pocket of the skirt. 3 volumes of household accounts. Her records, her handwriting, 7 years of labor documented to the penny. A change of clothes. Her Bible. She took nothing that was his. Not the silver hairbrush he had given her on their 2nd anniversary. Not the wool shawl she loved. Not even the quilt from the bed, though she had stitched every inch of it herself, because it had lived in this house too long, and she did not want to carry anything that smelled of this place. She stood at the writing desk. She set the wedding ring on the bare wood in the center where he would see it immediately. She pulled a blank page from the drawer, thought for a long moment, and then put it back. She had spent 7 years speaking to a man who was not listening. She saw no reason to leave him a letter. The hall clock read 3:45 when she came down the stairs for the last time. The house was still. The kitchen was dark. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The swept floors, the banked fire, the hanging herbs above the window that she had dried herself from her own garden, the copper pots she had polished until she could see her own face in them. The house ran because she made it run. It had always run because she made it run. And tomorrow morning, Delia would arrive at 6 and find no instructions, and a husband who would be furious and confused and completely unable to explain to himself how so much had functioned for so long without his noticing who was doing it. Clara picked up her bag. She went to the front door. She put her hand on the latch. "Ma'am?" She spun. Delia stood in the kitchen doorway, a candle in one hand, her house wrap pulled over her shoulders. The old woman looked at Clara, at the traveling dress, the bag, the bonnet, and her face did something complicated. Not surprise. Something that looked, if Clara was reading it right, almost like recognition. "You're going," Delia said. It was not a question. Clara held very still. "Delia." "Don't." The old woman shook her head once. "Don't explain it to me. I've been watching this house 7 years, same as you." She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pressed something into Clara's free hand, a small cloth parcel tied with twine. "Cornbread and salt pork. Enough for 2 days if you're careful." Clara looked down at the parcel. Her throat closed. "The South Road," Delia said quietly. "Before the crossroads, there's a surveyor's camp, been there 3 weeks. Man named Boone, Caleb Boone." She met Clara's eyes. "He's a decent man. Treated my nephew fair when he surveyed the Miller land last spring. You get tired, you get turned around. You find that camp." Clara could not speak for a moment. "Go on," Delia said. She jerked her chin toward the door. "The rooster's got no patience." Clara gripped the old woman's hand once hard brief, and then she lifted the latch and walked out into the dark Virginia morning. The air struck her like something she had forgotten entirely. Warm and green and alive, smelling of the fields her family had once walked freely, the fields her father had sold, the fields that had been traded for a marriage that had turned out to be no kind of trade at all. The stars were still thick overhead. The road south was a pale thread in the darkness. She did not look back. She had spent 7 years looking back at a version of this marriage she had wanted it to be, tending it, watering it, refusing to bury it long after everything had died. She was finished with that now. She was finished with small. She was finished with quiet. She was finished with convenient. Her name was Clara Vance. It was on the deed in her pocket. It had been waiting for her the whole time. She walked south and the rooster crowed behind her once, just as she reached the bend in the road, and Clara Vance did not slow her step, did not turn her head, did not hesitate for even half a breath. She kept walking. The cornbread was still warm. Clara noticed that first, the small specific warmth of it through the cloth as she walked, Delia's hands having wrapped it just minutes before, and the fact of that kindness hit her somewhere unexpected, somewhere behind the ribs, where she had been keeping everything locked down since the staircase, and she had to stop walking for exactly 3 seconds and breathe through it before she could continue. She had not expected anyone to see her go. She had not expected anyone to care. That was the thing about being convenient. You started to believe that was all you were. You stopped imagining that anyone was watching closely enough to notice the weight you carried or to press food into your hands before you walked into the dark. 7 years of being furniture, and Delia had been watching the whole time. Delia had known before Clara had known. She tucked that thought somewhere safe and kept walking. The South Road was quiet at this hour, just birdsong starting thin and tentative. In the trees to the east, the first gray loosening of the sky, that meant the sun was thinking about showing up, but hadn't committed yet. Clara had walked this road 100 times in daylight, to the market, to church, to the occasional neighbor visit that Jonathan approved of because it made him look like the kind of man whose wife had a social life. She had never walked it in the dark. She had never walked it alone with a bag on her shoulder and a deed in her pocket, and absolutely no certainty about what came next. It felt, she discovered, entirely different. It felt like breathing. She had gone perhaps a mile when she heard the horse. She stepped to the edge of the road instinctively, her heart jumping before her mind caught up. The hoofbeats were coming from behind her, from the direction of the Hale property, and for one long, terrible second, she was certain the way you are certain in nightmares, that it was Jonathan. That he had woken. That Delia had said something, or he had found the ring, or he had simply sensed, the way a man senses the loss of something he owns, that the arrangement had been disturbed. She pressed herself against the tree line and held very still. The rider came around the bend, and she saw immediately it was not Jonathan. The man was younger, leaner, sitting the horse differently. Not Jonathan's straight-backed performance of authority, but an easy practice slouch that said he had spent more time on horseback than in parlors. He had surveying equipment tied to the saddlebag, a canvas roll, a theodolite case, leather straps worn soft with use. He was going to pass her entirely. Then the horse slowed. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat without stopping the horse completely, just checking the pace, looking at her with the careful, unalarmed attention of a man who encountered unexpected things regularly and had long since decided not to make theater of it. "Morning." "Morning," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He looked at the bag on her shoulder. He looked at the road behind her. He did not ask. "You headed south," he said. "I am. Long walk from here to the crossroads." "I'm aware." He considered this. He had a plain, weather-worn face, not young exactly, maybe 30 or so, with the kind of stillness around the eyes that came from spending long hours reading land rather than people. He didn't look at her the way Jonathan's friends looked at her, the way most men looked at a woman alone on a road before sunrise. He looked at her the way he might look at a survey marker, noting the fact of it taking the bearing moving on. "Caleb Boone," he said. "I've got camp about a half-mile south. You're welcome to rest if you need it. Martha, my sister, she's there. She starts coffee before the sun's up." Clara studied him for a moment, Delia's voice in her head. "He's a decent man." "Clara," she said. She almost said Hale. The name died in her throat before it reached her lips. "Clara Vance." Something crossed his face, not recognition exactly, more like a small adjustment, a recalibration. He nodded once. "Miss Vance. Half a mile south on the left side. Can't miss the survey stakes." He rode on. He did not look back. Clara stood on the road for a moment watching him go, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember, like she had been told the truth simply and without cost. She picked up her bag and followed. Martha Boone was nothing like what Clara expected, which meant she was exactly what Clara needed. She was perhaps 45 with Caleb's same steadiness and none of his quietness. She was the kind of woman who filled space with efficiency rather than noise, who had 3 things done before you finished asking about the first one. She took one look at Clara, arriving at the edge of the camp in her traveling dress and bonnet, and said, "Sit down before you fall down," and poured coffee without asking whether Clara wanted any. "How far did you walk?" Martha said. "About a mile and a half." "From which direction?" Clara hesitated only briefly. "North." Martha looked at her over the rim of her own cup. She did not press. She handed Clara the cornbread, recognized Delia's wrapping, and said nothing about it, and pulled a camp stool close, and sat down like a woman who had conducted many such mornings. "Caleb says you're heading south." "Yes." "To what?" "I haven't decided exactly." Martha nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable. "You have family down that way?" "No." Clara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The warmth of it was extraordinary, the simple, uncomplicated warmth of something that was exactly what it claimed to be. "I have land. My mother left it to me. West of here, registered at the county seat." Martha went still for just a moment. Then, "In your name, in my maiden name, registered before my marriage." Something shifted in Martha's expression, quick and sharp and knowing. "And your husband," she said carefully, "is he aware of this land?" It was not quite a question. "No," Clara said. Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up, refilled both cups, and said, "You'll need a witness when you go to the county clerk, someone who can attest to your presence and your claim. Caleb's licensed by the state. His survey documentation carries legal weight." She paused. "In case that's useful information." Clara stared at her. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Martha sat back down. She wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who had seen a great many things and felt no need to be precious about any of them. "I know you well enough," she said. "I've met you before. Different names, different roads. Same morning." Clara felt something move in her chest. Not the ache, something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. "My mother's name was Margaret Vance," Clara said. "The deed is in her name, transferred to me in 1806. I have the original document." "Then you have more than most women start with," Martha said. Caleb returned to camp at mid-morning, having ridden ahead to mark the survey line, and found Clara and his sister sitting across from each other at the camp table, with the deed spread flat between them and 3 volumes of household accounts stacked to one side. He stood at the edge of the camp and took this in without comment. "She's got a strong claim," Martha said without looking up. "Land's registered clean. No husband's signature, no transfer document. Premarital asset." "What's the complication?" Caleb said, because there was always one. "Richard Mercer," Clara said. Caleb's expression changed slightly. Not fear, something more measured than that. He pulled up a stool and sat down across from her. "What's your connection to Mercer?" "He's my husband's business partner, or he was until 6 months ago." Clara kept her voice even. She had been organizing this in her head since the staircase, sorting it the way she sorted household accounts, fact by fact, line by line. Jonathan and Mercer had a land agreement. Mercer was supposed to purchase 40 acres east of the creek from Jonathan. But the deed records don't support the sale. Jonathan sold land he had already mortgaged to a bank in Richmond. Mercer doesn't know. Jonathan's been collecting payments on property he doesn't fully own. Silence fell over the camp. Caleb looked at her steadily. "How do you know this?" "Because I keep the accounts." Clara met his eyes. "Jonathan brings the ledgers home. I copy the household figures. I have been reading the full documents for 3 years." She paused. "I didn't know what to do with it. I thought—" She stopped. She had thought that knowing and doing were the same thing. She had thought that if she understood the problem clearly enough, some solution would eventually present itself inside the marriage, inside the life she had already agreed to. She had been wrong about that, too. "I have documentation. 3 years of discrepancies cross-referenced against the county mortgage records I requested through the courthouse." Caleb sat back. He looked at Martha. Martha looked at him. "She's been building a case," Martha said, and she sounded, Clara thought, almost impressed. "I didn't know that's what I was doing," Clara said honestly. "I thought I was just keeping accurate records." "Same thing," Caleb said quietly. "Sometimes same thing." He picked up one of the ledger volumes and opened it. His eyes moved down the columns, the careful, practiced eye of a man who read technical documents for a living. His brow came together slightly. Then he turned to the next page, and the next. He looked up. "Your husband doesn't know you have these?" "No." "And Mercer has no idea the Richmond mortgage exists?" "Not unless Jonathan told him, which I doubt." Caleb set the ledger down. He looked at Clara with the direct, unperforming attention she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at things. "Miss Vance, what is it you're trying to do? Exactly. Tell me plainly." Clara folded her hands on the table. She had not said it aloud yet, had not shaped it into words, had only felt it as a direction, A compass bearing the way, you know south, without having named it. But the words were there. They had been building for 3 years, maybe 7, maybe longer. I want my mother's land, she said. Registered in my name, uncontested before my husband realizes I'm gone and tries to file against it. I want the Mercer fraud documented and in the hands of someone who can act on it, because innocent men are losing property to a scheme they don't know they're in. And I want... She stopped for just a moment, steadied. I want to build something on that land, something that can't be taken from me again. The camp was very quiet. A bird moved in the tree line. The morning heat was beginning to settle that particular Virginia summer weight that pressed down like a hand by 10 o'clock. Somewhere south down the road she had been walking, there was a county seat and a clerk's office, and a record that bore her name. Caleb looked at Martha. Martha said nothing. She was watching Clara with the expression of a woman taking a very careful measurement. Then Caleb said, "The county clerk opens at 8. We can be there by tomorrow morning if we ride." He stood. "Martha will go with you. I'll file the survey documentation as a supporting exhibit gives your claim a legal backbone." Clara looked at him. "You don't have to do this." "No?" he agreed simply. "I reckon I don't." He picked up the ledger volume and handed it back to her. "But Mercer tried to underpay my survey fee last spring and told me the shortfall was a rounding error." He held her gaze. "I keep accurate records too." Clara took the ledger. And for the first time since the staircase, since the word maintenance had dropped through the floor of her life, she felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of not being alone in this. They broke camp at noon. Martha had it packed in under an hour, moving with the unhurried precision of a woman who had done this many times and saw no virtue in rushing what was already efficient. Clara helped without being asked, folding canvas, loading the survey cases, tying the saddlebag straps with the same systematic attention she had brought to 7 years of household management, and Martha noticed. "You're organized," Martha said. "I had to be," Clara said. "Different thing," Martha said in exactly the tone Caleb had used. Clara was beginning to understand this was how they spoke direct, without decoration, meaning exactly what they said. She decided she liked it enormously. They were mounted and moving south by midday when Caleb, riding slightly ahead, raised his hand and slowed. Clara's stomach dropped. She looked back instinctively, the old reflex, the 7-year habit of checking whether Jonathan was displeased, and hated herself for it. But it wasn't Jonathan. A man was standing in the road ahead. Well-dressed, broad-shouldered, hat in hand. He had the polished, deliberate look of someone who had planned this moment. Clara did not recognize him immediately. Then she did. Richard Mercer. Her blood went cold. He was looking at her. Not at Caleb, not at Martha. At her. And his face had the careful, pleasant expression of a man who wants something and has decided to be agreeable about asking for it. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "What a fortunate coincidence." Clara did not answer immediately. She sat on the borrowed mare and looked at Richard Mercer in the noon sun and felt every one of her organized thoughts realign like compass needles finding north. He knew. Or he suspected. Or Jonathan had woken and found the ring and sent word ahead, this road, the only road south, and Mercer, with his connections and his easy smile and his absolute confidence that women alone on roads could be redirected. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "I'm afraid I'm on a schedule." Of course. He smiled, the smile of a man who has never once believed a woman's schedule mattered. "I only wondered if you might pass a message to Jonathan. I've been trying to reach him about the East Parcel bit of a complication with the title records, nothing serious but time-sensitive." His eyes moved briefly to the bag tied to her saddle horn, to the ledger case behind her, back to her face. "Are you traveling far?" "Far enough," Clara said. Caleb had said nothing. He sat on his horse to Clara's left and slightly forward, not aggressive, not performing, just present, the way a survey stake is present, marking a line. Mercer's smile tightened a fraction. He looked at Caleb. "Boone." "Mercer," Caleb said. Funny place to run into each other. Not particularly, Caleb said. I'm surveying this county. I'm in this road every day. A beat. Mercer looked back at Clara. Something had shifted in his expression. The pleasantness still there, but thinner now, stretched over something harder. Mrs. Hale, he said. Jonathan will be worried. Then he'll have something to think about, Clara said. Good day, Mr. Mercer. She clicked her heels, and the mare moved forward, and Mercer stepped aside. Not because he wanted to, she could feel that in the set of his shoulders as she passed him, but because there were two of them, and one of him, and Caleb Boone's horse was between him and the road, and some calculations are simply too obvious to ignore. She did not look back. She heard Martha's horse fall in behind her, and then Caleb's, and the three of them moved south in the noon heat, and Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead, and breathed through the shake in her hands until it passed. He'll send word, Martha said, coming level with her. I know, Clara said. How long before Jonathan comes after you? Clara thought about it. About the ring on the desk. About Jonathan waking, finding the bedroom empty, calling for her, not finding her, and the slow, incredulous dawning of a man who has never in his life been left by anyone, because everyone in his life has always understood their position. He won't come immediately, she said. He'll be furious, and he'll tell himself I've simply gone to a neighbor, gone to clear my head, gone somewhere explainable, because the alternative that I left with intention won't make sense to him. Not at first. She paused. We have today, maybe tomorrow morning. Then we ride faster, Caleb said simply. And they did. They reached the county seat by late afternoon. The town of Harwick was small enough that three riders arriving together drew exactly the kind of attention Clara had hoped to avoid. She felt eyes on her from the moment they turned onto the main road, a woman in traveling clothes on a borrowed mare, flanked by a surveyor, and his sister moving with the particular urgency of people who have somewhere to be before sundown. In a town this size, that was a story before you opened your mouth. Don't look at anyone directly, Martha said quietly, pulling level with her. Not because you've done something wrong, because looking invites conversation, and we don't have time for conversation. Clara kept her eyes forward. The courthouse was at the end of the main road, 2 stories of brick with a flag hanging limp in the summer heat. Caleb had been here before she could tell by the way he navigated without checking the way he tied his horse at the post nearest the side entrance, rather than the front. He moved like a man who understood which doors were faster. Clerk closes at 5, he said, stepping down. We have 40 minutes. Clara was already moving. The clerk's name was Harold Pitts, and he was the kind of man who had held minor institutional power long enough to believe it was the same thing as real power. He was perhaps 60 with ink-stained fingers and the expression of someone perpetually interrupted, and he looked at Clara over the counter with the practiced indifference of a man who had spent decades deciding which requests deserved urgency. Ma'am, he said, not warmly. I need to file a claim of title, Clara said. She set the deed on the counter between them. This land was registered in my name in 1806. I am the sole heir, and the registration predates any subsequent legal agreements. I am here to affirm my claim of active ownership. Pitts looked at the deed. He looked at Clara. He looked at the deed again. You're married, he said. I am. Then your husband has no legal instrument against this property, Clara said. The deed was registered in my maiden name before the marriage. My husband has never filed a claim, a lien, or a transfer request against it. The property remains mine under the terms of the original registration. She held his gaze. I have the original document, 3 supporting account records, and a licensed surveyor prepared to file an exhibit of confirmation. Pitts blinked. Caleb stepped forward and set his own documentation on the counter beside the Deed Survey Records County license stamp of state authorization. He said nothing. He simply put the papers down with the quiet confidence of a man whose credentials did not require explanation. I'll need to check the register, Pitts said slowly. Please, Clara said. He disappeared through the back door. Clara stood at the counter and did not move. She could feel the shake in her legs, not fear exactly, more the particular trembling of a body that has been running on something other than rest for 14 hours and is now being asked to stand very still at a critical moment. She pressed her feet flat to the floor and breathed. Martha appeared at her elbow. "He'll find it," she said quietly. "A registration that old, that clean, he'll find it. And if he decides not to process it today, then we come back tomorrow," Martha said simply. "And the day after. And we keep coming back until he does." Clara nodded. She thought about Jonathan, about the road between here and the Hale property, about Richard Mercer's eyes on the noon road, that careful, calculating attention that had told her everything she needed to know about what was coming. Pitts returned. He had a large bound register under one arm and the expression of a man who has found exactly what he was told he would find and is not entirely pleased about it. "Margaret Vance," he said. "Transferred to Clara. Margaret Vance, 1806. He looked up. "You." "Me," Clara said. He set the register on the counter and turned it toward her. There it was, her mother's handwriting transferred at the bottom of the page to Clara's own name in the careful script of the county recorder. The ink was brown with age. The entry was clean and uncontested. "I'll need your signature," Pitts said, "and a witness attestation." "I'm her witness," Martha said, stepping up. "Martha Boone, licensed notary, Cumberland County." Pitts looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. The recalculation of a man who had assumed this would be more complicated to refuse, and has just discovered it will not be complicated at all. He reached for his stamp. Clara signed her name. Clara Margaret Vance. The pen moved across the page with the steadiness of a woman who has been practicing this signature in her head since 4 in the morning, since the bottom drawer, since the staircase, since 7 years ago, when she should have known that her name was the most important thing she owned. The stamp came down. The claim was filed. Clara stood at the counter and looked at the stamped document and felt the floor solid under her feet for the first time all day. Then the door behind her opened and Jonathan Hale walked in. She heard his boots on the floor before she turned. She knew the sound of his walk, the particular weight of it, the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of a man who expected rooms to reorient around his arrival. Her body responded before her mind did the old animal reflex of 7 years, the instinct to make herself small and brace for the temperature shift that always preceded his displeasure. She turned anyway. Jonathan had ridden hard. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the dust on his coat, the particular brightness in his eyes that she recognized as fury being held at the leash by the presence of witnesses. Richard Mercer was 2 steps behind him, and behind Mercer, a third man she didn't recognize, broad, watchful, with the look of someone brought along for a specific purpose. Jonathan's eyes went to the counter, to the deed, to the register, to the stamp. His jaw tightened. "Clara." His voice was controlled, just barely. "Jonathan." Hers was steadier than she expected. He crossed the room in 6 steps. He did not look at Caleb. He did not look at Martha. He looked only at Clara, and she understood that this was deliberate, that in his mind this was still a private matter, a domestic matter, a matter between a husband and a wife that could be resolved by the appropriate application of authority. "We're going home," he said. "No," Clara said. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Pitts went motionless behind the counter. Mercer stopped moving. Even the third man shifted slightly, as if the floor had done something unexpected beneath him. Jonathan looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the way he looked at furniture. Not the practiced non-attention of a man for whom his wife was simply part of the background, but with the focused, sharpened attention of a man who is encountering something he has never considered possible. "Clara." Lower this time. "A warning. I've filed my claim," she said. "The land is registered in my name. It was registered in my name before we married and has never been transferred. The county record confirms it." She kept her hands still at her sides. "There is nothing for you here, Jonathan." "You are my wife," he said. "I am." She held his eyes. That doesn't change what the deed says. Mercer stepped forward. Hale, perhaps we should— Stay out of this, Richard, Jonathan said without turning. Mercer closed his mouth. Jonathan looked at Clara for a long moment. She could see him calculating not her feelings, never her feelings, but the angles. The legal angle, the social angle, the angle of a man trying to determine how much damage had already been done and how much could still be contained. Whatever you think you're doing, he said quietly, you don't understand what you're stepping into. I understand exactly what I'm stepping into, Clara said. The question is whether you understand what you're already standing in. Something shifted in his face, the first real uncertainty she had ever seen there. She picked up her copy of the filed deed from the counter and folded it into her pocket. They left the courthouse with Jonathan 3 steps behind them, and the street was worse. Word traveled fast in Harwick. Clara could see it in the way people had positioned themselves, the small clusters of watchers near the dry goods store and the post office, the particular stillness of a town that has sensed disruption and arranged itself for a better view. She kept walking. She had learned in 7 years that the best response to public scrutiny was motion. Clara! Jonathan caught her arm just past the courthouse steps. She stopped, turned, looked down at his hand on her arm. He released it. Not because she asked him to. Not because Caleb Boone had moved 2 steps closer and was standing with the patient, immovable quality of a survey stake in high wind. Jonathan released her arm because he saw for the first time what it looked like. Out here, in daylight, with people watching. You want to do this publicly? He said. Low, even with the contained fury of a man who has realized he has miscalculated. Fine. Then let me tell you publicly what your little piece of land is worth without a husband's credit behind it. You can't farm it. You can't maintain it. You have no money of your own, no standing to take a bank loan, no. I have 3 years of documented fraud, Clara said. The street went quiet. Jonathan's face did something she had never seen it do before. It went blank. Completely, entirely blank, not the blankness of a man who doesn't understand what's been said, but the blankness of a man who understands perfectly and is trying to determine in real time whether to deny or deflect or run. She reached into the satchel. She pulled out the first ledger. The East parcel sale to Richard Mercer, she said clearly, not loudly. She didn't need to be loud. The street was already quiet. The property was under a Richmond bank mortgage at the time of the sale agreement. Jonathan, you collected full payment from Mercer on land you did not fully own. The mortgage records are filed in Richmond. The payment ledger is in my handwriting. I've been copying your financial records for 3 years. She heard Mercer make the sound behind her. Not words. Just a sound, the sound of a man feeling the ground shift without warning. You're lying, Jonathan said, but his voice had lost its certainty. The edges of it had gone soft and ragged in a way she had never heard before. I never lie, Clara said. You said so yourself. I'm reliable. Someone in the small crowd made a sound. It might have been a laugh. It might have been something else. Jonathan took a step toward her. Caleb stepped forward, unhurried, and the step landed him between them, not aggressive, not threatening, just there. Present. Immovable. Jonathan stopped. He looked at Caleb, at Martha, at the crowd that had quietly doubled in the last 3 minutes, at Mercer, who was standing with his hat in both hands and an expression that had traveled very rapidly from calculation to panic, at Clara, who was standing in the afternoon sun with a ledger book in her hands and her shoulders straight and her feet flat on the ground. This isn't finished, Jonathan said. No, Clara agreed. It isn't. But it started. She tucked the ledger back into the satchel. The documentation will be filed with the county records office before close of business today. Caleb Boone's survey exhibit is already on record. The Richmond Bank has been sent a letter, I wrote it this morning, and Martha Boone witnessed it, and will post it today. She paused. You have time to speak with a lawyer before any of this becomes a formal complaint, Jonathan. I would suggest you use it. The blankness on Jonathan's face cracked. Something raw showed through, not guilt, she thought, not remorse. Something more naked than that. The expression of a man who has built his life on the assumption that the people around him are not paying attention and has discovered too late that one of them has been taking notes. He turned and walked away. He didn't run. Men like Jonathan Hale never ran in public. But she watched the deliberate control of his retreating back, and she knew with the certainty of a woman who had studied every movement of this man for 7 years, that the control was costing him everything he had. Mercer lingered for one moment. He looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Anger, yes, but underneath it, something more complicated. The beginnings of a man who is doing arithmetic he doesn't like. "Mrs. Hale," he started. "Miss Vance," she said. He blinked. "My name," she said, "is Clara Vance." She held his eyes. "And I'd speak to a lawyer this afternoon, Mr. Mercer. Today, while there's still time to be cooperative, is considerably better than tomorrow." Mercer left without another word. The letter to the Richmond bank had not actually been written yet. Clara told Caleb this as they walked back toward the horses quietly under the still buzzing noise of the dispersing crowd, and Caleb was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Do you want to write it now or after supper?" "Now," she said, "before I lose my nerve." "You haven't shown any signs of losing your nerve," he said. "That's because you haven't seen the inside of my hands," she said, and held them out, the fine, barely visible trembling that had been there since Jonathan walked through the courthouse door, invisible at distance, undeniable up close. Caleb looked at her hands. He looked at her face. "Miss Vance," he said, "you just did the hardest thing a woman can do in this state in the year 1814. With 4 witnesses, a county stamp, and a fraud exposure, that's going to make a very uncomfortable autumn for 2 of the wealthiest men in this county." He paused. "A little shaking seems about right." Clara laughed. It came out unexpected, sudden, and real, the kind of laugh that has nothing performed in it, that rises straight up from the place where you've been holding everything down all day. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and Caleb looked slightly alarmed for a moment, and then very carefully smiled. Martha appeared at Clara's other shoulder and pressed a canteen into her hands. "Water," she said. "Then we find a room for the night and you write that letter. Tomorrow we deal with what comes next." "What comes next?" Clara said. Martha looked at her steadily. "The land," she said. "Your land. We ride out and see it tomorrow morning." She paused. "You've been fighting to get to it. Time you actually looked at it." Clara pressed the canteen to her lips and drank, and thought about 32 acres of timber and creek bed. Her mother's name in a county register. The ink brown and old and perfectly uncontested, waiting for her, the way it had been waiting since 1806. She thought about what you could build on land that was entirely and indisputably your own. And then she thought about Jonathan walking back down the Harwick Main Road with the deliberate, furious composure of a man who has just been surprised and has not yet decided what to do about it. He would decide, she knew that. He would go home and he would think, and he would come back with something, a lawyer, a counterclaim, another angle she hadn't seen yet. Because men like Jonathan Hale did not stop, they simply regrouped. She capped the canteen and handed it back to Martha. "Write the letter first," she said. "Then we plan for what he does next." Martha took the canteen. "Good," she said, with the brisk satisfaction of a woman whose faith in someone has just been confirmed. "Now you're thinking like someone who's going to win this." Clara picked up her satchel and walked toward the door of the small Harwick Inn, and the afternoon sun was long and golden, and the courthouse stamp was dry on her deed, and her name. Her real name, her mother's name, was on record in the county register and could not be unstamped, unclaimed, or taken back by any man who had ever made the mistake of thinking she was not paying attention. She had been paying attention the entire time. The letter to the Richmond bank took her 2 hours to write. Not because she didn't know what to say. Clara had known exactly what to say since the moment she'd pulled the first ledger from the bottom drawer 3 years ago and seen the numbers that didn't align, the dates that didn't match the mortgage entry that sat quiet and damning beneath 4 layers of ordinary household accounting. She had known then. She had simply not known yet that knowing was permitted to become doing. The difficulty was precision. Every word had to carry weight without excess. Every figure had to be cited with a corresponding page and entry number. She was not writing a complaint. She was writing a record, the kind of document that could not be dismissed as a wife's confusion or a woman's misunderstanding. The kind that made a bank officer sit forward in his chair and reach for his own ledgers. Martha sat across the small inn table and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. Caleb had gone to speak with the local land agent about the western parcel quietly, without announcement, the way he did everything. He came back at dusk with the specific, contained expression of a man carrying information he hasn't yet decided how to deliver. Clara looked up from the letter. "What is it?" He sat down. He set his hat on the table. "The land's been occupied," he said. "Squatter. Been there about 4 months from what the agent says. Man named Cord. He's built a structure on the north edge of the creek property." Clara set her pen down. "He knows it's registered land," Martha said sharply. "He knows it's unclaimed land," Caleb said. "Or he thought it was. Nobody's been out there in years. The registration was current, but there was no visible owner activity. He's got a lean-to and a kitchen garden, and 3 months of established residency, which in this county gives him a squatter's argument if the owner doesn't appear in person to contest." "I'm appearing," Clara said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Which is why we ride out tomorrow morning first light." He looked at her steadily. "It may not be simple." "Nothing has been simple today," Clara said, and picked up her pen. She finished the letter at 9 o'clock. She read it back twice, changed 2 words, and signed it. Clara Margaret Vance, in the same steady script she had used on the county register. Martha sealed it and tucked it into the postal bag that would go out with the morning rider. Clara sat back in her chair and felt the exhaustion hit her all at once, the full comprehensive weight of a day that had started before 4 in the morning with a wedding ring on a writing desk and had ended here in a small inn in Harwick, with a deed in her pocket and a fraud exposure in the county record and a squatter on her mother's land. "Sleep," Martha said. It was not a suggestion. Clara slept. She dreamed about the staircase. Not Jonathan's voice this time, just the stair rail under her palm, the particular texture of the wood the moment before she heard anything. The moment when she was still a woman going down for water. Still a woman who believed the shape of her life was fixed and permanent and survivable. She woke before dawn and lay in the unfamiliar dark and understood that she would never stand on that staircase again. The grief of it surprised her. Not for Jonathan. She had finished grieving Jonathan sometime between the bottom drawer and the front door. But for the woman she had been on those stairs. For 22-year-old Clara, who had brought wildflowers inside and believed that a man who remembered the name of your mother's dog was a man who would remember you. That woman deserved a moment. Clara gave her one there in the dark before she got up and put her boots on. The western parcel was 6 miles from Harwick, down a road that became a track, that became something you followed more by instinct than by marking. Caleb navigated without hesitation. Martha rode beside Clara and pointed out land features, the way another woman might point out dress fabric, with genuine specific interest, naming the soil types, the watershed patterns, the tree varieties that indicated where the ground was soft and where it would hold a foundation. "You know land," Clara said. "Caleb taught me to survey when I was 14, Martha said. "Our father said it was a waste of time teaching a girl to read maps." She paused. "He was wrong about a great many things." Clara recognized that particular sentence. She had said its cousin 100 times in the last 24 hours. They heard the squatter before they saw him. He was chopping wood, the rhythmic, unhurried sound of a man who believes himself alone and unobserved, and when the 3 riders came through the tree line, he stopped mid-swing and turned, and Clara saw immediately that he was younger than she'd expected. Perhaps 25, lean and weathered, with the wary, calculating eyes of a man who has been moving from place to place long enough to recognize the specific trouble that arrives on horseback. He set the axe down slowly. "This is private land," Clara said. She kept her voice level, not aggressive, not apologetic. The voice she had used at the county clerk's counter, clear, factual, prepared. The man looked at her. At Caleb. Back to her. "Didn't see any markers," he said. "The registration is on file at Harwick. Filed yesterday, confirmed and stamped." She reached into her satchel and produced the deed copy. "My name is Clara Vance. This land was my mother's. It's mine now." She held his eyes. "I'm not here to make trouble for you, but you cannot stay." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the small structure he'd built. She could feel the weight of that look, the calculation of a man adding up months of work against the odds of winning an argument he already knew he'd lost. "I got nowhere to go," he said. Not aggressive, just honest. "I know," Clara said. And she did. She recognized the specific exhaustion of a person whose options have narrowed to the point where an illegal lean-to on unclaimed land begins to look like stability. She had felt something like it herself, standing at her own front door in the dark. "I'll give you 2 weeks to gather your things, your garden, whatever you've built. 2 weeks and I'll ask nothing more of you." She paused. "But I need you gone by the end of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once the nod of a man who has been treated fairly enough not to push further. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, Clara confirmed. She turned the mare and rode back to where Caleb and Martha were waiting, and Martha said very quietly, "That was well done." "It was the right thing," Clara said. "Right things and well-done things aren't always the same," Martha said. Today, they were. They rode the perimeter of the land for the next 2 hours. Caleb surveyed as they moved, making notations in his field book, with the practiced efficiency of a man for whom landscape was a language. He described what he saw without sentiment: soil quality, drainage patterns, the structural integrity of the creek bank, the value of the timber stand on the north edge. Clara listened and translated everything into something else entirely, what her mother had seen when she registered this parcel. What her mother had intended for it, the quiet foresight of a woman who had looked at 32 acres of Virginia woodland and decided to put her daughter's name on it before anything could go wrong. Something had gone wrong anyway. But here Clara was. She was standing at the creek's edge watching the water move over the stones when she heard the second rider. Caleb heard it too. He was off his horse and moving toward her before she'd fully processed the sound, putting himself between her and the tree line, with the same unhurried, inevitable quality he brought to everything. The rider that came through was not Jonathan. It was Delia's nephew. Clara recognized him from the Hale property, a young man named Samuel, perhaps 19, who ran errands for Delia and occasionally helped with the horses. He pulled up short when he saw Caleb and held both hands away from his body, immediately the gesture of someone who wants very badly not to be misunderstood. "Miss Clara," he said, breathing hard. "Delia sent me. She said you'd need to know." Clara stepped forward. "Know what?" "Mr. Hale rode to Richmond this morning, before first light." Samuel swallowed. "He took papers with him. Delia heard him tell the stableman he was going to the courthouse there, going to file something about the marriage accounts." He looked at her with the careful, urgent eyes of someone delivering a message he doesn't fully understand, but knows is important. "She said to tell you he's not coming after you on the road. He's going around you." Clara felt the cold move through her before the thought fully formed. The marriage accounts. Jonathan didn't need to fight the land deed. The land deed was clean, premarital, uncontested, stamped by the county. He couldn't touch it directly. But if he filed a claim in Richmond against the marriage accounts, if he argued that the household ledgers Clara had taken were his property, his financial records taken without consent, he could potentially invalidate the documentation she'd filed with the fraud evidence. Not the deed, but the evidence that made the deed's context matter. He was going around her. "How long ago did he leave?" Caleb said. 3, maybe 4 hours, Samuel said. Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. The calculation was the same for both of them. "Richmond is 8 hours by horse," Caleb said. "If he left at dawn, he'll be there by mid-afternoon," Clara finished. "The courthouse closes at 5. She was already moving toward her horse. If he files before 5, the claim goes into the record before our fraud documentation can be cross-referenced. She swung up into the saddle. We need someone in Richmond before he gets there. I can ride? Samuel said immediately. I know the Richmond road. I can cut through the Miller property, saves near an hour. Clara looked at him. He was 19 years old, and he had ridden out here on Delia's instruction, and he was offering to ride 8 hours to Richmond on behalf of a woman he barely knew, because Delia had asked him to. The loyalty in that, the layered, uncomplicated loyalty of it, hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Samuel, she said, I need you to carry a letter to a man named Arthur Finch. He's a lawyer in Richmond on Canal Street, above the mapmaker's shop. I met him once 3 years ago at a county survey hearing. He represented a woman in a land dispute. She looked at Caleb. Do you know him? I know of him, Caleb said carefully. He's honest, which in Richmond means he's not wealthy, but he's honest. That's what I need. Clara reached into her satchel. She pulled out a blank page and borrowed Caleb's field pen and wrote fast not the careful measured precision of the Richmond bank letter, but the compressed, urgent shorthand of someone who knows exactly what she needs and has limited time to ask for it. She folded it, wrote Finch's name on the outside, and handed it to Samuel. Tell him Clara Vance sent you. Tell him Jonathan Hale is on the Richmond Road and will reach the courthouse by mid-afternoon. Tell him I need the fraud documentation entered into the court record before any counterfiling by Hale can be accepted. Samuel took the letter. He looked at it, looked at her. What if he won't come? Show him the letter, Clara said. If he reads it and still won't come, then find the court registrar directly and present yourself as a witness to the county filing in Harwick. Your testimony about the timeline has legal standing. Samuel blinked. It does. It does, Caleb said with the authority of a man who has spent 15 years navigating county legal frameworks. You were present for the filing. Your account of when it occurred is part of the evidentiary record. Samuel straightened slightly. All right, he said. All right. He turned his horse. He looked back once at Clara. Delia said to tell you something else. Clara waited. She said... He paused, sorting the words carefully, making sure he got them right. She said you were always the one running that house, and now you just need to run something that's actually yours. He touched his hat brim, the instinctive, slightly awkward politeness of a young man who has been taught that gesture without being entirely sure when to use it. She said you'd know what to do with that. He rode. Clara watched him go into the tree line and felt the tightness in her chest shift into something she didn't immediately name. It took her a moment. Then she recognized it. Purpose. Clean and uncomplicated, and entirely hers. They were back in Harwick by midday. Caleb went directly to the telegraph office. There was no telegraph to Richmond, but there was a fast courier service that ran twice daily, and he arranged for a duplicate of the Harwick court filing to be carried south by the afternoon rider. It cost more than Clara had. Caleb paid it without discussion, and she did not argue with him because some things you accepted and settled later, and this was one of them. Martha had spent the morning in town and returned with information the way other people returned with groceries, practical, organized, immediately useful. She had spoken to 2 women at the dry goods store. She had spoken to the postmaster's wife. She had spoken to a widow named Helen Greer, who lived on the edge of town and owned the only boarding house with a room to spare. Helen Greer also, Martha said, setting her packages on the inn table, lost 40 acres to a fraudulent sale 12 years ago. She never recovered them. But she's been watching Mercer operate in this county ever since, and she has documentation of her own. Martha paused. She wants to know if your case can carry a second complaint. Clara looked up. A second complaint, she repeated. Helen Greer's 40 acres, filed against the same Mercer pattern 12 years earlier. If 2 frauds can be documented against the same party in the same county, Martha left the sentence where it was. It becomes a pattern, Caleb said from the doorway. Not an error, not a misunderstanding. A practice. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about 32 acres of timber and creek bed and the lean-to she'd given a young man 2 weeks to vacate. She thought about what she had told Caleb she wanted, not just the land, not just the claim. Something she could build. Something that couldn't be taken. "Bring Helen Greer here," she said. "This afternoon." Martha smiled. It was small and unhurried and entirely satisfied. "She's already waiting downstairs," she said. Helen Greer was 61 years old, walked with a cane she didn't need for balance but used as punctuation, and had the specific, undeceivable intelligence of a woman who had been underestimated so many times she had stopped being surprised by it and started finding it useful. She looked at Clara across the inn table with the measuring attention of someone deciding how much to invest. "You filed this morning," Helen said. "Yesterday afternoon," Clara said. "Stamped and recorded. And the fraud documentation. In the county record, duplicate sent to Richmond this afternoon, and a letter to the bank Hale mortgaged against." Helen looked at the ledgers. She picked up the second volume and opened it with the particular confidence of a woman who has read financial documents before and knows what she's looking for. Her eyes moved down the columns. She turned 3 pages. She stopped. "This entry," she said, putting her finger on the page. "October 1811, the Mercer payment for the East parcel." "Yes," Clara said. "He collected the same payment from me," Helen said. "Different property, different year. Same structure. Full payment collected on land under mortgage never disclosed." She looked up. Her eyes were very steady. "I couldn't prove it without the mortgage records. I had no access to the Richmond bank files. I have them," Clara said. "Copied from Jonathan's correspondence. 3 years of records." Helen Greer set the ledger down. She was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who has waited a very long time for a very specific thing to arrive. "Miss Vance," she said, "what do you intend to do with this land of yours?" Clara looked at her, at Martha across the table, at Caleb in the doorway, his field book under his arm, waiting with his customary patience for the shape of the next thing to become clear. "I intend to build a records office," Clara said. The words came out fully formed, as if they had been waiting for exactly this question. "A place where women can register deeds, document transactions, file claims with witnesses, with legal support, with someone who will read the county records on their behalf and tell them what they actually own." She held Helen's gaze. "Because most women in this county don't know what's registered in their name. And the men who benefit from that are counting on them, never finding out." The room was very still. Helen Greer looked at her for a long time. Then she put both hands flat on the table and pushed herself to standing. And she held out her right hand across the ledgers and the deed copies and the 3 volumes of 7 years of invisible labor, and Clara Vance stood up and took it. "Then we'd better make sure you win this first," Helen said. "Because Jonathan Hale is in Richmond right now, and men like Jonathan Hale do not lose gracefully." "No?" Clara agreed. "They don't." She looked at the window, at the afternoon light going long and golden over the Harwick Street. Somewhere south and east, Jonathan was riding hard toward a courthouse with papers in his hand and fury in his chest, and the absolute unshakable certainty of a man who has never had to fight for something he considered already his. He had never in all the years she had known him fought a woman who had been paying attention. Clara turned back to the table. "Tell me everything you remember about the 1811 sale," she said to Helen. "Every detail. We're going to need all of it." Arthur Finch arrived in Harwick at 7 in the morning. Clara heard the horse first, the particular urgency of a rider who has covered ground fast and isn't pretending otherwise, and she was already at the window of the inn when he came into the street below. He was a small man, compactly built, with the kind of face that forgot to be impressive and ended up being trustworthy instead. He had ink on his coat sleeve, and his hat was dusty from the road, and he looked exactly like a man who had read a letter at midnight and decided immediately that it required him to get on a horse. Samuel was 2 lengths behind him, slumped with exhaustion in the saddle hat pulled low. Clara was downstairs before Finch reached the door. Miss Vance, he said without preamble. He shook her hand the way he might shake a colleague's firm, direct no performance. Arthur Finch, I read your letter twice. Tell me what Hale filed. We don't know yet, Clara said. He rode to Richmond yesterday. We sent a courier with the duplicate filing, but we haven't had confirmation. Finch nodded, already moving toward the table where the ledgers were spread. May I? Please. He read fast. Clara watched his eyes move across the columns and recognized the particular quality of his attention. This was a man who had spent years reading documents that other people had hoped he wouldn't fully understand. He turned pages without comment. He stopped twice, made small notations in the margin of his own notebook, kept reading. Martha set coffee on the table. Finch drank it without looking up. Helen Greer came down from her room at 7:30 and took the chair across from Finch and said, "The 1811 entry, page 43. Finch turned to page 43. He read. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but the focused sharpening of a man who has just seen the shape of what he's dealing with. 2 complaints, he said. Different years, same mechanism. Same mechanism, Helen confirmed. I have my original purchase agreement. I have the payment receipts. I never had the mortgage records. She looked at Clara. Until now. Finch set the ledger down. He looked at Clara with the direct assessing attention of a man deciding how much confidence is warranted. Miss Vance, what Hale files in Richmond, if he files a claim against the ledgers as marital property taken without consent, it won't invalidate your deed. The deed is premarital and clean, but it could complicate the fraud documentation if a Richmond judge rules the ledgers inadmissible as evidence. He paused. Which means we need to establish the ledger's validity before any counterclaim can be heard. How? Clara said. Witnesses, Finch said. Who else saw these records? Who can attest that you maintained them, that they were your work, that they reflect transactions you personally documented? Clara thought about it. Delia. She's been in that house 7 years. She saw me work the accounts every week. She paused. Samuel saw the ledgers yesterday when I showed them at the property. I can attest to the county filing, Caleb said from the doorway. I was present. I witnessed the timestamp. Finch was writing. Anyone else? Clara thought harder. She thought about 7 years of sitting at the writing desk while Jonathan moved through the house around her, bringing papers home, without thinking about who was in the room, leaving correspondence on the hall table, because the hall table was Clara's domain, and therefore invisible. She thought about the men who had come to dinner and talked business over her head because she was furniture that had been trained to pour correctly. Edward Miles, she said slowly. Everyone looked at her. Miles was at the house 2 nights ago, she said. He and Jonathan discussed the East parcel sale. In the parlor, while I was on the staircase. She looked at Finch. He doesn't know I heard. He doesn't know what I have. But Miles has been uncomfortable since he saw me on the road yesterday morning. I could see it. He's doing his own arithmetic. She paused. If Mercer goes down for the fraud, Miles loses his investment in the East parcel. He already knows the title is compromised. If someone were to suggest to him that cooperation with the county investigation might protect his own standing. Finch stopped writing and looked at her fully. You want to use Miles as a cooperative witness, he said. I want to give Miles a reason to tell the truth, Clara said, which is different. Finch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Miss Vance, how long have you been thinking about this? 3 years, she said. I just didn't know what I was thinking toward. Finch looked at Martha. Martha looked at Helen. Helen made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. All right, Finch said and picked up his pen again. Here is what we do. The plan was this: Finch would ride to Richmond that morning with the original ledgers, the deed copy, Helen's purchase agreement, and a formal complaint signed by both Clara and Helen Greer, filed as a joint civil action against Richard Mercer for fraudulent land sale. 2 counts, 2 victims, 2 decades of documented pattern. The joint filing would elevate the complaint from a domestic dispute between a wife and her husband's business partner to a civil fraud action with multiple plaintiffs, which was a different category of legal weight entirely. Caleb would accompany him as an expert witness, his survey credentials establishing the land values and boundary documentation that gave the financial discrepancies their concrete grounding. Samuel would carry a letter to Edward Miles, not threatening, not accusatory, simply informative. A quiet account of what had been filed, what evidence existed, and the observation that individuals who came forward voluntarily tended to be treated considerably better by the court than those who waited to be called. Martha would stay in Harwick with Clara. "Why are you staying?" Clara asked her when the others had ridden out and the inn had gone quiet. Martha poured herself coffee and sat down across from her. "Because someone should be here when Jonathan comes," she said simply. "And because you've been running toward things for 2 days. It's time to stand still and let something come to you." Clara looked at her. "You think he'll come here?" "I think he's already on the road," Martha said. "Richmond didn't give him what he wanted, or if it did, he doesn't know yet whether it worked. Either way, a man like Jonathan Hale doesn't wait for a letter. He comes in person because he believes that physical presence is the same as authority." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Let him come. You have the deed. You have the filing. You have Finch and 2 complaints in a Richmond courtroom." She met Clara's eyes. "What does he have?" Clara thought about it. "A marriage," she said. "Yes," Martha said, "which is considerably less than he thinks it is." Hi. Jonathan arrived at noon. He came alone this time, which surprised her. No Mercer, no hired man, no audience. Just Jonathan Hale on his gray horse riding into Harwick, with the dust of 2 hard days riding on him, and something in his face she had not seen before. Not fury. Something quieter than that and more dangerous. He found her in the inn's front room because she had chosen to be found there. She had not hidden. She had not left town. She had sat at the table with her hands folded and her deed in her pocket and waited for him to arrive, because Martha was right. Some things you ran toward, and some things you let come to you, and you had to know the difference. He sat down across from her without being invited. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Richmond rejected the filing," he said. His voice was flat. "They said the ledgers were household accounts maintained in a wife's hand and didn't constitute marital property subject to a retrieval claim." He paused. "My lawyer said it was a long shot to begin with." Clara said nothing. "You knew that," Jonathan said. "Not an accusation. Something almost like realization. You knew they'd reject it." "I thought they might," she said. "The precedent isn't strong." He looked at her across the table. Really looked at her the same way he had looked at her in the Harwick courthouse, that focused, sharpened attention that she had almost never received from him in 7 years of marriage, and she thought distantly that it was a bitter thing to be truly seen by someone only after you had stopped needing them to see you. "What do you want, Clara?" he said. Quiet, direct, stripped of performance for perhaps the first time since she had known him. She had thought about this. She had thought about it on the road and in the inn, and lying awake in the dark of an unfamiliar room. She had organized it the same way she organized everything, fact by fact, line by line, no excess, no decoration. "I want the legal separation filed in this county," she said. "Irreconcilable abandonment, initiated by me, uncontested by you. I want my maiden name restored in the county record. I want the western parcel registered in my name as sole owner, no marital claim, no future dispute." She held his eyes. "And I want you to sign a statement confirming that the household ledgers were maintained by me in my hand, reflecting transactions I personally documented, which makes them my records and legitimate evidence in the Mercer complaint." Jonathan was very still. "You're asking me to help you destroy my business partner," he said. "I'm asking you to tell the truth about your wife's work," Clara said. "What it does to Mercer is a consequence of the truth, not my responsibility." "Mercer will come after me," Jonathan said. "If he goes down for the East parcel fraud, he'll name me as a co-conspirator." "Yes," Clara said. He will. Silence. You knew that too, Jonathan said. Yes. He looked at the table, at his own hands, at the space between them that held 7 years of everything that had not been said and most of what had. Why give me the warning, he said. Why not simply let it come? Clara considered the question honestly. Because you were not always cruel, she said. You were careless. You were negligent. You married a woman you intended to use, and you used her without apology and without acknowledgement. She paused. But the fraud, I don't believe you designed it. I believe you made a reckless decision and let Mercer handle the details and chose not to ask too many questions. She held his eyes. That is a different category of wrong. It deserves a different consequence. Jonathan looked at her for a long time. You're letting me get ahead of it, he said slowly. If I sign the statement, cooperate with the fraud complaint, come forward voluntarily. Then you're a witness, not a defendant, Clara said. That is the best outcome available to you, Jonathan. I would take it. Another silence. Outside, the summer heat pressed against the town, thick and unmoving. A horse shifted at the post. Someone's voice carried from down the street, ordinary and unhurried, the sounds of a town that had no idea what was being decided in a quiet inn room over 2 untouched cups of coffee. Jonathan reached into his coat. He set a folded document on the table between them. Clara looked at it. My lawyer drew it up this morning, Jonathan said. Before I wrote out. The separation filing uncontested. Your name restored. He met her eyes. I'm not a good man, Clara, but I am occasionally a practical one. She picked up the document. She read every word. She turned the page and read the back. It was exactly what she had asked for. She looked up. The ledger statement. He pulled out a second paper. Shorter. His signature already at the bottom, witnessed by the Richmond courthouse notary that morning. Clara took both documents. She held them in her hands and felt the weight of them not heavy, surprisingly. Lighter than she expected. Lighter than 7 years of not having them. I'll have Finch notified, she said. Your cooperation will be entered into the court record. Jonathan nodded. He stood. He picked up his hat from the table and turned it once in his hands, the gesture of a man who has more to say and has decided for once not to say it. At the door, he stopped. The house runs poorly without you, he said. Not an apology, just a fact delivered in the flat, factual tone of a man making an accounting entry. I know, Clara said. He left. The Mercer complaint was heard in Richmond 6 weeks later. Clara was not in the courtroom. Finch was. Caleb was. Helen Greer was sitting straight-backed in the witness chair with her purchase agreement in one hand and 12 years of patient, furious memory in the other. And she gave her testimony in the clear, unhurried voice of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this moment and intends to use every second of it. Edward Miles appeared voluntarily. His testimony confirmed the East parcel transaction, the payment structure, and the absence of any mortgage disclosure. He looked by all accounts like a man who had made a decision he found uncomfortable and was making it anyway, which was about the best anyone could say for him. Richard Mercer's lawyer argued procedural objections for 2 hours and then ran out of objections. The judgment came down on a Thursday. Fraud, 2 counts. Mercer's license to conduct land transactions in the Commonwealth of Virginia was suspended indefinitely. Helen Greer's original complaint was upheld, not the land itself, which had changed hands twice in 12 years, and could not be simply returned, but a financial remedy that she had not dared to anticipate. Finch sent a letter. Clara read it at the table in the small structure she had built on the north edge of the creek property, 4 walls, a proper roof, a writing desk she had bought herself from a Harwick carpenter who had asked no questions and charged a fair price. Outside, the 2 weeks had long passed, and the young squatter named Cord had left as promised, and the land was hers entirely, and uncontestedly hers in every direction she could see. She set Finch's letter on the desk beside the deed. Martha appeared in the doorway. She had been in Harwick all morning, and she had the particular expression she wore when she was carrying news she considered worth carrying. Helen's talking to 3 other women, Martha said, from the South County. They've heard about the complaint. They want to know if there's someone who can look at their land records." She paused. "I told her to send them here." Clara looked at the desk, at the deed, at the space around her that was hers to fill. "I'll need a proper table," she said. "Large enough for 3 ledgers open at once." "I'll tell the carpenter," Martha said. "And a sign," Clara said. "Outside, so people know what this place is." Martha leaned against the doorframe. "What is it?" Clara thought about her mother's handwriting in the county register, brown ink on old paper, a woman placing her daughter's name on something solid before the world could make it otherwise. She thought about Delia pressing cornbread into her hands in the dark. She thought about a staircase and a ring on a writing desk, and the road south in the hour before dawn, and what it felt like to walk into air that had no memory of who she was supposed to be. "The Vance Record Office," she said, "for women who need to know what's theirs." Martha nodded once, the small, satisfied nod of a woman whose faith has been confirmed completely. Clara turned back to the desk. She opened the first ledger, a new one empty, bought from the same Harwick stationer where she had bought the ink and the quill and the sealing wax, and she wrote the date at the top of the first page in the careful, deliberate hand her mother had taught her at a kitchen table in another life. June 1815. Then she wrote 2 words beneath it. Case 1. She had not left her marriage to become no one. She had not walked out into the dark before the rooster crowed to disappear into quiet and safety and a smaller life than the one she had already survived. She had walked out because she knew somewhere beneath 7 years of being managed and overlooked and reduced to her usefulness that she had always been the one keeping the records, and that records kept carefully and honestly, and with full attention to what they actually said, were the most powerful thing a woman could hold in a world that preferred her not to read them. Clara, Margaret Vance, pressed her pen to the page and began to write. And outside the summer light fell long and gold across her mother's land, and the creek moved over the stones, the way it had moved for 100 years before she arrived and would move for 100 years after. And the sign above the door bore her name, her real name, the name she had carried back from the place where it had been waiting, and it was not a small life. It was entirely, irrevocably, ferociously hers.